Uh, Thank you all for coming, and thank you in particular to our guest, Professor Erin Taylor of Washington and Lee University. We're having a little bit of a different from the norm talk this time. Professor Taylor is an ethicist and associate professor of philosophy. She specializes in theoretical ethics, applied ethics, and medical ethics. She's published on irresolvable conflicts, the justification of obligations attached to social or professional roles, and the justificatory function of moral principles. And she's going to be presenting today on why human in the loop may exacerbate value alignment challenges. And I'm hoping that we can sort of start the process of breaking down some of these barriers between practitioners who work on AI and the ethics and policy people who are trying to grapple with some of the implications of the models that we're developing. Because I think we really need to get some of those conversations started. So yeah, thank you, Professor Taylor, very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that nice introduction.
One question
Sure.
before we start, sorry. Do you prefer that people interrupt you with questions or wait to the end?
I don't know. I think if people can wait to the end, that would be great. But if they have like clarificatory questions or something's not clear, then I'm happy to be interrupted.
All right, sounds good.
I guess it depends on how urgent it is. Okay, so let me just give you the basic idea of what I'm going to be claiming, because that might help to kind of help people follow the thread of what I'm going to say. So the basic idea that I have is that a human in the loop system, we all know that they're at least partly intended to act as safeguards in high stakes use cases. But I think it can kind of paradoxically or unexpectedly worsen value alignment challenges. And I want to say why I think that is. And it boils down, at least the two reasons that I'm going to talk about in this talk. The two main reasons are these. So the first is that, and again, this is just simplified as much as possible, knowing the right answer to a problem, an ethical problem, at least, is sometimes easier than knowing why that is right. And then the second reason that I think that human in the loop can exacerbate value alignment challenges is that human in the loop shifts the decision attribution to a human. And when that happens, then in terms of justification, often the human has to meet higher justification standards than a non-human. Okay, so before I get into why I think those are the case, I just want to mention briefly like why I'm talking about this, because as you know, I'm not primarily an AI researcher. I don't really do that, but I am an ethicist. I do specialize in medical ethics, and I am on an IRB. So IRBs are institutional review boards, and they are tasked with overseeing the ethical standards for studies that involve human subjects. So if a biomedical researcher is going to test a new drug or a new device or something like that, then they will have to submit that protocol to an IRB, and the IRB, consisting of a mixture of different people, they kind of issue a non-appealable decision about whether or not that research can go forward. Okay, now recently, IRBs have been trying to figure out how to solve some of their organizational problems. And so let me just talk about why AI is even discussed in these contexts. So right now, IRBs are in a kind of a crisis situation because they're understaffed. There's really long processing time with reviewing these protocols, and you can probably imagine biomedical protocols are very, very complicated. Also, the IRBs often lack some domain expertise that are necessary for thorough review. And often the researchers themselves have a lot more domain expertise than the reviewers, so there's a kind of expert imbalance there. There's also conflicts of interest between certain IRBs and ethics, quite honestly. So what happens is that with recent changes in regulations, FDA regulations, they require single IRB review of protocols that are kind of multi-site. So in other words, just many different universities or hospitals are involved in a particular study, then that will have to be reviewed by a single IRB. And with the single IRB, a lot of these are turning to a kind of corporate IRB. And the corporate IRBs are hired by the researchers. So there's a conflict of interest there. Okay, and there's others, but those are the big ones. So there's big problems with IRB review. Okay, so a lot of people who are involved in this space think, oh, well, here's an opportunity for AI to actually make a huge and beneficial difference to solve some of these problems. I mean, you can probably see already how if there's an asymmetry in the experts between the IRB and the researchers, that AI might be as assistant in helping the researchers, helping the IRBs kind of get a handle on the research that is being proposed. Okay, so that's the background. So here's a kind of toy case. I'm going to just use this case over and over when I talk about some things that I want to talk about in this talk. And it's a toy case because it's super easy to understand. It's obviously just a summary of one particular element of a particular study. But it's a real world case that actually did happen and people are still fighting about it. So I'm going to use this one. I think it's a good case. So here's where like a biomedical researcher, this is really be a group of researchers. They want to run a study that investigates heart medication. So let's say there's a phase 1 study. They're enrolling healthy subjects. It's a non-therapeutic study. They want to see like how the drug interacts with the body for these healthy subjects. They're trying to recruit subjects that are low income, so they might be indigent subjects, and they want to pay them a lot of money for participating in this study. Okay, so hopefully I don't really have to explain how this might possibly be problematic. There's a question like, is the study okay as it? Okay. So, okay, so can we use AI to help evaluate these protocols? Well, again, I don't really have to tell you that there might be some issues with using AI. So definitely people in this space do not feel comfortable using AI to fully automate the review of these protocols. And it's obvious why that might be. So they have kind of a lack of trust in AI for making what are called determinations. So determinations is the term that IRBs use to refer to the decision that is made, like can the protocol go ahead as is, or does it have to be changed? So there's a lack of trust with using AI to make determinations. Why? Well, partly because the determinations are really high stakes. I mean, we're dealing with people's lives and their health. And so this is a kind of a use case that is really sensitive to ethical review. A lot of the populations that we're dealing with are vulnerable, so that compounds to the issue. And also people don't think that there's been sufficient tests, right? So testing, evaluation, verification, or validation of the LLM or other kinds of models in this context. But here's the big reason that people aren't using are comfortable with using AI in this space, and that is that AI doesn't decide based on reason. Okay, so I just want to show you. I just took this from an excerpt of an SOP, or a standard operating procedure. So it's a document that explains how the IRB is going to deal with certain issues. So here's an addendum to an SOP specifically about the use of AI for making determinations. And this excerpt's a little long, but I highlighted the main point. So the basic idea is that this is the particular IRB that's led by one of my collaborators. So he's the CEO, and he basically is saying AI cannot be used to make determinations, and here's why. The way that AI works is not. It doesn't work in the right way. Basically, what we need is an explanation that justifies decision and provides a basis for challenge. Okay, so the basic policy is that the board will not use machine learning to automate any of the subjective aspects of IRB decision making. Okay. So humans have to be in the loop. And I think that even though I'm talking about IRB in particular in this talk, I think that basic idea of having humans in the loop, AI can help, but humans have to make the final determination. That general idea is going to generalize to most justice or compliance use cases for these AI models. So things like criminal sentencing, stuff like that. Okay. All right. So again, why is that? Well, the AI would have to justify responses with reasoning that withstands scrutiny, and the human in the loop needs to be able to defend the AI's suggestion. Okay, so what does that take? So decisions have to be responsive to the reasons that explain why the decision is morally correct. So that's the basic idea. So let's see what that requires. So in ethics, that's going to require adverting to ethical principles or values. Okay, so how would that work in this particular case? So, the HHS federal regulations that apply to this kind of case, I'll just excerpt them here. It says an investigator shall seek such consent only under circumstances that provide prospective subject or the representative sufficient opportunity to consider whether or not to participate that minimizes the possibility of coercion or undue influence. Okay, again, so here we have the federal regulations adverting to ethically thick concepts like consent or coercion or undue influence. So these are right in the regulations, they're a part of the law, and protocols has to abide by them. Okay, so when we're looking at the particular case of a biomedical researcher who wants to enroll a low-income subject into a non-therapeutic trial and pay them a lot of money to do so, what we're concerned about, or at least what the IRB would be concerned about here, primarily is whether or not that human subject is actually consenting to the trial. And then under that, whether or not they're coerced by their circumstances or they're being unduly influenced. Okay. Okay, so there's a lot of trouble with ethical principles. So some of them are going to be really commonly known, and then some less commonly known. So let's get the commonly known ones out of the way, just right from the beginning. So the trouble with ethical principles is that there's at least using them in order to ground the truth for the purposes of these AI models, is that, as everyone knows, there's a lot of variability in foundational ethical principles. And that is going to make finding the ground truth difficult. Now, that's an easy one, I think, to solve. I think it's easy to solve because we can just stipulate some of the foundational ethical principles and then move on. And that's, in fact, what medical ethics and research ethics already does anyway. And you can see that kind of thing happening, for example, with models like Anthropic's model, Claude. They have a kind of constitutional AI architecture that just injects foundational ethical principles into the model. Okay, so let's set that aside. I think that that can be easily dealt with. Okay. Specification is harder though. So the trouble with ethical principles is that it's really difficult to correctly specify them. I think that in terms of machine learning, this might be similar to what you would call misgeneralization. I'm not sure. You'll have to tell me. The specification is defined as the correct application of values or principles to specific situations in order to render justified decisions about what to do in situ. Okay. So when does specification failure happen? Okay, so there's a couple different ways that specification failure can happen. So the first way is that the principles are underdefined. Okay, what does this mean? Well, it means that it's not really clear what action a substantive value or principle actually requires in, for example, unusual, or I think you would call them out of distribution circumstances. So, for example, does the principle of autonomy, which is the ground truth principle that the consent rules are based on, will that allow people to be paid extravagant amounts of money? In what circumstances does it allow them to be paid extravagant amounts of money? Well, that's a difficult issue to solve, actually. And this is a widely acknowledged problem in medical and research ethics. Okay. The second problem with specification is that there can be conflict among multiple principles. So whenever you have a framework that includes multiple ethical principles as ground truth, like is actually the case in medical and research ethics, you have not only the principle of autonomy or the value of autonomy, but you also have the principle of beneficence or the value of beneficence. And these create a lot of conflicts in particular situations. These are often called moral dilemmas. And so this is also like widely acknowledged as a problem in medical and research ethics. Okay. And then the third reason for specification failure is that the procedural parameters are unclear. So this is a little bit harder to explain, or it's not, this isn't as widely acknowledged, but this happens when a situation is so, let's say, out of distribution. A situation is so unusual that no one even knows how to frame the problem. Like it's, no one knows what to do. It's like everyone's hair is on fire. And so we often find these particular situations happening where there's like really novel technology, or there's a complete failure of the regular institutional governance procedures that would normally deal with how to specify principles in particular cases. So I'll give you an example of a case that has just specification failure because of the procedural parameters are unclear. So earlier in my career, I was involved in this case where researchers had found out how to modify mosquitoes in a way that would allow them to kind of have a gene drive that would collapse the mosquito population in a particular area, and a collapse of the mosquito populations in that area would be a collapse of the vector for malaria. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to get IRB approval to release genetically modified mosquitoes in a particular place where they had already staked out and done the modeling for, and this place was in Mali. Okay, so they wanted to release these GM mosquitoes in Mali, but the problem was they had to get permission from the human beings that would be impacted by this. And the problem there was that it was unclear who they were even supposed to ask, number one, and it was also unclear how they would even approach getting consent documents. Why? Well, because the people involved in the case or that would be impacted just did not agree with modern Western ideas of disease vectors. They thought that that malaria was caused by magic. And so they had no idea how to even proceed. Okay, so that's what I call a situation where the procedural parameters are unclear. Okay. So that's the problem with ethical principles. Is there any solution to the problem with ethical principles? Well, so recently, as I understand it, researchers have been working on how to try to get models such that humans in the loop would be better at determining whether the model is correct in its response. Okay. And so there's a recent paper, for example, by some researchers at NYU, along with some researchers at Anthropic that tried to use debate techniques. And the idea was that when you had AI models debating each other, then that would surface some things that the human who wasn't as knowledgeable could use to help suss out what was true and what was false. Okay. Now, to be fair, it was really clear in this research that these debate techniques were only tried with sussing out ground truths that were empirically verifiable. Okay. So that was the basis of this research, and that's what they were trying to figure out. They did not actually, to my knowledge, discuss what would happen or what would be the case for non-empirically verifiable ground truth. Now, this is exactly what a human would need to figure out for the ethics task. They would need to figure out what the non-empirically verifiable truths are. In other words, what is the correct determination for these ethics use cases? Okay. So I wanted to just do a vibe check with some of these models to see if it might work, like to see how debate might work for the kinds of use cases that I'm interested in. That is, could it actually help an IRB member, someone who had gotten a protocol, could it actually help answer ethical questions? Okay. And it doesn't really work. It actually makes it worse. Okay, so debate techniques make it worse when it comes to non-empirically verifiable ethics tasks. Why is that? Well, so I actually tried this myself. Again, I can't produce any like statistics on this. It's not really what I do. I just kind of did a vibe check to see what would happen. And here's what I did. So I asked, I've been using DeepSeek and playing around with that recently. So I used DeepSeek and I was like, look, I just got this, I'm an IRB member. I just got a protocol who had this element in the protocol. And I gave it a description of the case that I gave you. A case where, you know, the researcher wants to investigate this heart medication involving low-income subjects. It's non-therapeutic, and I want to pay them this amount of money, $1,000 for their participation. So I asked DeepSeek to evaluate that, and I asked them to provide an actionable checklist that would help me get to the bottom of it. And here's what it did. It gave me a really good response. So that's great. It gave me a really thorough evaluation, like things that I would have to check. In other words, things that I would ask the researcher to tell me about in order to see if that in fact was an ethically defensible part of the protocol, or if I would reject it and have them go and redo that part of the protocol. So it actually did a really good job. And what I did is I took those exact recommendations. I told DeepSeek that that those recommendations had been followed to the letter. And then I told it to generate a report based on that, articulating why that protocol element was defensible. And it did that. Okay, so it now generated that report. I then took that report and uploaded it back to DeepSeek. And I told DeepSeek that I was an IRB member who had just gotten this report from another IRB member. And I thought that they were incorrect, but I couldn't articulate why. Okay. So could it please help me articulate why that report was wrong? Okay, so I basically wanted to see if it would generate a debate. Okay. And what happened is, again, it did what I asked, and it did it really, really nicely. It's very, very good, actually. It responded by refuting its own initial recommendation, but it didn't do so with a direct denial. Instead, what it did is it reintroduced non-empirically verifiable ground truth to call into question the original recommendations. Okay, so basically what the original recommendation was is that, and this is what an IRB does, is that it took the ethical question and it converted the ethical question to a checklist of empirically verifiable things. And then if this checklist could be satisfied, then the protocol was ethical. And if the checklist could not be satisfied, then the protocol was unethical. This is in fact what actual IRB generally do, okay? So that it did really well with that. But then when it had to actually reflectively check to see if that was right, what it did, and again, this is what an actual IRB member would also do, an actual ethicist would do, is it reconverted the empirically verifiable checklist to non-empirically verifiable like elements, right? And those really could not be answered. So it kind of reverted back to philosophical question. Okay.
Well, I have a question about that. That's pretty cool. Did you go a step further? I don't know if this is a good interrupter question or not, but did you go a step
No, no.
further and then take the critiques, the new counterpoints, and say to generate a new checklist to verify of those counterpoints because like to have it could potentially, I would imagine, is it possible to produce sort of an endless stream of empirically verifiable arguments that just result in more empirically verifiable checklists, but never,
Yeah,
complete the question?
yeah. So the problem is that yeah. So you mean like, did I just iterate on that? Is that the question?
Yeah, now that like you said, okay, here's the problem, generate empirically verifiable checklist about for this problem. You say, okay, it did it. Now generate critiques to argue against in the other direction. It's not empirically verifiable, but you could say, well, what about what are new things that you could do to verify the new critiques, or
Yep.
either
Yeah.
in either direction, either to disprove or disprove.
Yeah. So yes, it did do that. Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it did. So it produced another, another recommendation because I asked it to actually take the point of view of the IRD member. I mean, I gave it really explicit instruction, but that it's something that I wanted the model to help me do as the IRD member. So it actually did a really good job. And it did exactly that. It gave new recommendations that were like kind of empirically verifiable. But exactly, it runs them into the same problem when it's iterated on to date. And this isn't, I mean, so it's a cool result, but it wasn't surprising to me because if you actually look at the what has to be done is that the IRB actually has to decide whether or not substantively, as a matter of substantive principles of political morality, whether or not it's okay to take indigent healthy subjects and then use them as guinea pigs for a pharmaceutical company. And at the end of the day, that is not an empirical question. It just isn't. Now, what happens is that in bureaucracy, and this is like what I found, and it vibes with my own experience. Like when you take these substantive philosophical questions and you put them into a bureaucracy, then the bureaucracy has to deal with empirical things, right? But it's always just like a layer deep. You know what I mean? You could go around and around and around, and I did this again. I don't have any statistics, so I just did it like a couple of times and only with one model. But that's exactly what would happen, is that it would just keep going back to the philosophical question. Okay, now the reason that did that answer your question?
Yes, more or less. Yeah, I think yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. So the reason that I think that is that's a problem is that actually far from helping an IRB member, it actually muddies the waters, because let's say I have this, let's say I kind of have an idea about whether or not it's appropriate, this element of the protocol is appropriate. The debate techniques are not, like, they could actually just take me away from that initial response. And then they wouldn't allow me to get any closer to the truth. It would just iterate in an endless loop. So my conjecture is that, look, simple pattern matching would be actually more reliable, and that's what humans do anyway. So what happens is that, they have a kind of, they're told a general principle, and then they're given examples about what kinds of things count as falling under the principle and what kinds of things count as violating the principle. And then they just kind of, they look at new examples based on that. And if a human can't do that, then a principle justification won't help. And I saw that really clearly in the iterations of the DeepSeek query, that they would get really, they get really sophisticated in their analysis, but it wouldn't be really, it wouldn't be helpful if you're an IRB member. Okay. Okay. So that is the first reason. So remember, I have a second reason. And that's that human in the loop adds an additional complication. So let me just quickly say what I think this is. So if there's a human in the loop, then the decisions that the model makes, that is the response of the model, the human is going to then decide whether that response is a good one or not. But then if the human is deciding, then that decision is going to be attributable to the human. And human attributable decisions must, not all the time, but often meet different justificational standards. Okay, and these justificational standards are often more demanding. Okay, so it actually makes it harder if you attribute a decision to a human than if you attribute it to a non-human. Okay, so why is this? Well, I think ethicists have different way of talking about it, but I think in terms of like machine learning, I think the language, would be the distinction between external and internal alignment. So the reason that we, or at least what ethicists care about generally in terms of the responses of AI models, is that they're externally aligned. Like they're actually they're getting the responses that we want them to get. And I understand that people are sometimes, they talk about internal alignment for AI models, but for an ethicist, that's not useful, because for an ethicist, internal alignment means, or is at least predicated on the idea that you have an agent that can not only get the right response, but it gets the right response on the right motive. So as soon as you have something that is not generating a response for a motive, like on the motive of a certain kind of, for the motive of beneficence or the motive of respect for person, then you don't get internal alignment. Okay, so ethicists care about AI models being aligned in terms of their external alignment. However, ethicists do not only care about external alignment for human beings, they care very much about internal alignment for human beings. And not only do they care about it, but it's actually written into the law. How is it written into the law? Well, it's written into the law in medicine, for example, because certain people have to act as fiduciary to other people. And what it means to be a fiduciary is that not only do they have to do certain things, they have to make certain decisions, but they have to make those decisions for a specific kind of reason. They're actually violating ethical norms if they make the decision, but they make the decision for the wrong reason, or they have the wrong motives to make those decisions. So one example is the example of physicians. Physicians are required to be fiduciary to their patients. However, medical researchers are not required to be fiduciary to their subjects. So, so it's really important that if you have, for example, a physician who is recruiting subjects to a particular study and they're recruiting their own patients, it's really important that they recruit their patients not only and not even primarily because it's going to help their enrollment for the study, to get the study going, but they must actually recruit the patient for the patient's own good, right? So, so when we have human in the loop on top of an AI model generating responses, then that is possibly, in at least some use cases, and certainly this is going to be the case with medicine and research, we're adding an additional justificational requirement that would not be present in the bare response of the AI model. And that's basically it. I'm just going to leave it at that because I think we're out of time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Lewis, for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.